It's time to tune in to Defending the Faith with Frank Harber. Hear the latest about religious liberty.
A win for religious freedom in one of the remaining blockbuster cases facing the U.S. Supreme Court this term.
A legal battle continues for the Little Sisters of the Poor for nearly a decade now.
A street preacher armed with a speaker, a microphone, and a camera strapped to his chest is now banned from the village.
Our founding fathers believed in the separation of church and state, but not for one fleeting moment did they believe in the separation of God and government.
And powerful apologetics. Are you prepared to defend the faith?
I'm convinced unless we trust in God, this nation is finished.
We're facing a new kind of enemy. We're involved in a new kind of warfare, and we need the help of the Spirit of God.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Defending the Faith, and I'm your host, Frank Harber, and I am the president and the chief legal counsel for the Institute for Christian Defense. We help defend the faith, and we do legal cases we defend churches, nonprofits. We are defending a children's home right now, Christian ministries, Christian businesses. We help people maintain their legal rights. We also provide apologetics resources and materials, and we're all about letting people know about the truth, particularly why Christianity is the truth. And I've written a new book called Prove It, examining the evidence for the existence of God. If you don't have a copy, this one is brand new. The ink's still drying on it. We also have a free book called Objection Overruled, which you can get at our website, defendingthefaith.law. This book is on the top 10 objections to Christianity and how to answer them. And for those of you who have never heard my testimony before, for 21 years, I was a skeptic. I was an atheist. I set out to try to prove that Christianity was not the truth. And in studying Christianity, I discovered there is powerful evidence which demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that Christianity is the truth. And that's the focus of this program, which is Defending the Faith. And we have a very special guest today. Before I introduce him, I do want to give thanks to our producers who are in today, my two sons, Hunter and Graham Harber. And they do all the technical work to make this show look good, and appreciate them doing all they do. Today, we have a very special guest. Not only is he a great golfer, and he is, but he's a wonderful theologian. His name is Bryan Bivens. It is soon to be Dr. Bryan Bivens. He has an MDiv. He is working on a PhD at B.H. Carroll Seminary, and so he'll be doctor shortly. Now, he's the president and founder of One Bread Ministries International, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that as we get into the show today. But they equip leaders around the world. They're involved in evangelism, foundational church planting, cultural transformation, revival, and spiritual awakening. Today, we're going to talk about a special topic. We're going to talk about critical race theory. And, you know, you're an authority on this subject. You've done a lot of research. And so today, to kick the show off, I thought, you know, as we talk about this, I want you to just assume that none of us know anything about CRT. But today we want to talk about, what is it? Why is it important to know what it is? You know, what is our Christian understanding of this? But, you know, as we kind of get into that, kind of take us on this journey of how you know what this is and help us understand it.
Very good, Dr. Harber. Thank you again for having me, and happy birthday again. I trust that you're going to get to play some good golf at a great course soon. I appreciate, before we get started, just want to honor you. I appreciate what you and your ministry are doing for the church in defense of our civil liberties, our Christian civil liberties. God bless you in that. I pray for you, and we pray that what you're doing will not only gain volume, but will gain traction and momentum as you grow in this ministry. God bless you guys. Understanding Christian, or rather critical race, you have to sort of go back to the beginnings of the movement to understand how what we see today has manifested. And critical race theory is actually a branch of a larger doctrine called critical theory. And I'm going to be drawing on the thoughts of a few people who are far more experts, hold far more expertise in this field than myself. One of those that I would recommend all of the listeners look up is a man named Neil Shenvi, Neilshenvi. He is an evangelical voice and a genuine, true scholar in this field. He's actually a chemist who, for whatever reason, got involved in the study of critical theory and has become very in high demand, but also a great voice for our movement, for our faith with this topic. Race and CRT it's an extremely complicated issue. It demands careful attention, understanding, but it also demands great discernment. And one of the things that we'll see as we continue this conversation today is that critical race theory in particular, it's a lot like there's a scene in the movie Big Daddy. Now, I know this may sound silly, but there's a scene in the movie Big Daddy where the boy that Adam Sandler is attempting to adopt is playing cards. And as he's playing cards, he throws his cards down and he says, "I win." And he pulls all the chips into where he's sitting. And Adam Sandler just laughs. And then the other gentleman in the movie, played by Rob Schneider, says, "This is nonsense." But he uses an expletive there. He says, "This is nonsense. Why does he always win?" And the boy says, "Because I win." And critical theory demands discernment, because what has been crafted with critical race theory is a series of linguistic moves where language and some very clever thought have created a situation in society that organizes people into two groups. We're going to call them social binaries, to quote Neil Shenvi. But understanding why this is the way that it is, we have to go back and understand the history of the movement. Let me just give you a definition that I got from a Professor Trahan, who is the professor of law at Paul Hebert Law School. He quotes a definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Says, "A Marxist-inspired movement and social and political philosophy originally associated with the Frankfurt School, drawing particularly on the work of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud." The key word in that is the word structures. After the Russian Revolution and the uprising of communism in the 20th century, many theoreticians and thinkers of that era began to look and wonder why communism did not grow on a bigger level. And as Marx attempted to deal with society on an economic level, these theorists realized that the economics were not the main problem in the social overthrow that Marx predicted. So what they did was they began to dig into the social structures and the government systems that they believed enabled certain people groups to stay in power. One of the critical thinkers of that era was a fellow named Antonio Gramsci, or Gramsci. He was an Italian philosopher who actually died under the hands of Mussolini. But his idea was this idea of what we call hegemony, or hegemonic power is what he called it. And what that is a fancy word that basically says whoever is the dominant group is the group that gets to determine how everything works out in society. They began to look at what they called the superstructures, which in classical Marxist theory, it was something where society was made up of an economic base or an infrastructure, but there was also a superstructure that oversaw those things. So these guys began to examine how these structures functioned, and they determined that the Marxist overthrow that Marx predicted would never come to fruition because of an uprising in the proletariat versus the bourgeois, but they believed that the way to overthrow oppressive systems was to infiltrate the systems themselves, and over time work out those systems and dismantle them from the inside out. The Frankfurt School that we mentioned before were the primary proponents of that critical theory. The man that actually coined the term critical theory was a German philosopher named Horkheimer. And there was another man named Herbert Marcuse who became instrumental in bringing that doctrine to the United States. He worked with the Department of Defense. I believe it was the Department of Defense. It was one social government department, but he taught in our universities here in the United States, and he began to propagate this doctrine in the schools. Fast forward to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, when we saw the Jim Crow laws being dealt with and much of the issues with the segregated South and things like that. There were certain, I would say, factions within the civil rights movement that believed that the civil rights movement didn't go far enough, that equality of opportunity was not good enough. They wanted equality of outcome. And there was a man in particular named Derek Bell, who was a legal professor, or professor of law, rather, at Harvard. Derek Bell became somewhat famous and somewhat infamous in different groups in the 80s because he began to demand equality of outcome based on race within Harvard. And Derek Bell, along with a few other thinkers of that era, began to take critical theory and shape it into what we see today as critical race theory. I want to just give you a couple of definitions of what critical race theory is. A woman named Rebecca Bodenheimer said, at its very beginning, critical race theory is a school of thought meant to emphasize the effects of race of one's social standing. She says it originated among legal scholars like Derek Bell, who argued that racism and white supremacy were defining elements of the American legal system. So there's that word system again. She continues, of American society writ large, despite language related to equal protection, early proponents argued for a contextual, historicized analysis of the law that would challenge seemingly neutral concepts like meritocracy and objectivity, which in practice tend to reinforce white supremacy. So somewhere along the lines, and I haven't quite figured this part out yet, but somewhere along the way in the development of this doctrine, something happened where Marxist ideals merged with postmodernism. These are my conclusions on the movement. But I believe that somewhere along the way, Marxist ideals merged with postmodern ideals, and the idea of an overarching meta-narrative is exactly what postmodernism opposes. Marxism, in and of itself, is an overarching meta-narrative. So these two become strange bedfellows in this doctrine, in this political philosophy. And when you take a philosophy such as postmodernism and marry it to Marxism, what you've created is not a political philosophy, but rather a worldview. Because postmodernism stands in staunch contrast to Christianity. I suppose there's a movement within Christianity called liberation theology. And with liberation theology, many of these folks that believe in liberation theology have sort of taken up a social cause, and that theology has been used by Marxist political figures to sort of propagate and compel Marxism forward. The danger with these two marriages of philosophy is that it really creates a beast which cannot be fed. postmodernism drawing on the idea of nihilism and chaos, along with Marx's idea of violent social overthrow, right? It creates this sort of almost an undiscernible, indescribable monster. Neil Shenvi describes critical race as a social binary. His definition says simply, critical race is a system or a doctrine of thought that puts people into two primary groups, a binary group of society, that being those who are oppressed and those who are oppressors. And this is Marx 101. You draw lines between different people groups, and you figure out which one has the power, and you attempt to overthrow that power. So in a sense, what critical race has done is substitute economic-based power with race, overthrowing systems of thought. Neil Shenvi teaches that oppression occurs indirectly through cultural hegemony. So in other words, the dominant group exercises power over the subordinate group through power structures. This means that people are inherently oppressive, but it doesn't necessarily mean by choice. So what does that mean? It means that there's a word today called white privilege, a term today that we call white privilege. That term is being used to describe another term called whiteness and how is it effective in society. What that means is that a person who is born white, or specifically white and male, he has no choice but to benefit from his whiteness and from his maleness. In other words, whether he likes it or not, he's part of the oppressive group. On the other side of the coin, if a person is born, say, a black female, she intersects in an oppressed group and has no choice but to be oppressed. It really begins to identify people completely independent from their actual character, completely independent from their actual ability to function in society. It's based completely and solely upon how you were born. Another interesting characteristic of critical race today is an expression called lived experience. This is the idea that logic, objectivity, rationality, that these are not viable means of truth, but rather truth is determined by a person's individual experience. This is postmodernism 101, that there are no absolute truths, and that somehow my experience is my understanding of truth. Where this becomes dangerous is when your perception of truth clashes with my perception of truth, or rather, if your perception of truth clashes with social norms or with social even laws and structures that have been put in place. My truth is the new expression in postmodernism and in CRT. This also means that members of the oppressor group are not allowed to challenge the lived truth of the oppressed. That person must simply accept the claims of the oppressed as true. In other words, if you're having a conversation, you're an apologist, and you're sharing the gospel with somebody who has bought into critical theory, and you begin to speak of truth, which we as Christians, that is the fundamental basis of what we teach, that Jesus Christ is the exclusive revelation of truth. So when we begin to communicate truth with somebody that has bought into this doctrine, what we are essentially saying to that person is that we are part of the problem in their life, because we are putting forth an idea that we have a grasp on truth, and if it conflicts with their truth in any way, whether it be morality or ethics or anything that we communicate as truth, it comes across to them as being oppressive, because we are trying to oppress their lived experience. I hope this is making sense. It's also called standpoint theory. Standpoint theory means basically you don't understand the world because you can't see it from my point of view. This is another critical term today. There's another expression called the guise of objectivity, where oppressor groups, this means that oppressor groups hide behind what they claim to be normative. So the way that a CRT proponent would put this is if a person, let's say, disagrees with a claim that a person is inherently racist because they're white, the guise of objectivity would say, you're only denying that because you're trying to maintain your hegemonic power. And so if, let's say that a person of color makes a claim that that person's standpoint or that person's particular view is not true or does not stand up to what we would call truth, they would also use this guise of objectivity to say that you've just internalized oppression and you have accepted what somebody else put forward as oppression as truth or as normative. Another expression that you might hear CRT people use a lot is the term intersectionality. This is a lady named Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a professor at, I think, UCLA, or it may be UC San Diego, I can't remember. But basically, this means that people who live at the intersections of oppression experience being oppressed in unique ways. Therefore, a person who is perhaps homosexual, female, and a person of color would experience oppression at a higher level than someone who is, say, male and African American, or something along those lines. So it almost creates a chart where there are some people are more oppressed than others. Are you understanding where the danger of this is leading? The idea of it creates this idea.
Yes.
The idea of identity politics becomes front and center. And just to keep my explanation of this brief, the danger of identity politics is revealed in history. As Christians, I think that we have a fundamental, or at least I would hope that we have a fundamental understanding of innate depravity, or of the fallen nature of mankind, or original sin, or however you want to use that expression. The problem with traditional Marxism is that there's this idea, or this notion, that somehow if we get the systems just right, we organize the power structures just right, that everybody can have everything the same because humans are capable of constantly doing good to serve one another. But we know that humanity is inherently selfish. Because of that inherency, because of that issue with the human condition, we have a completely different understanding of how the human condition works itself out in society. Well, CRT has sort of taken that and shaped it into this let's call it a neo-Marxist revelation that somehow if we can get the racial conditions just right, or if we can, there are a whole other host of things that are part of this, but ultimately the goal of the critical theorists, or the critical race theorists, is to overthrow the systems of white, male, and Christian hegemony, and to reestablish systems that create equity. Now, the word equity that's being used today, especially in the left, in the political left, it does not mean, typically, it does not mean equality of opportunity, which means we both get a chance to go to college, we both get a chance to get a job, things happen, at the end of the day, we work hard and opportunities present themselves to us. But what we're seeing today in terms of equity is the expression equality of outcome, which means that regardless of how much effort you put into a situation or regardless of how much I put in, we both win. And this kind of started in the 80s when I was a child, and we started seeing that every child got a trophy on the soccer field, or regardless of hard work, regardless of how you were talented or how you were gifted, everybody was to be treated exactly the same. And we know that the world just doesn't function that way. So the issue that I see most of all is that when you begin to sort society into groups, whether it be political groups or racial groups or religious groups, you create this issue, this very carnal, very dangerous issue called tribalism. And tribalism typically emerges when one group begins to either establish dominance over another group or seeks to overthrow that group in order to establish dominance over it. And the danger of Marxism, what we have seen again and again and again through the Russian Revolution, through Mao's China, through what happened in Pol Pot in Cambodia, through Che Guevara and Castro in Cuba, what always happens is that the group that rises up eventually begins to oppress and even create genocide on the existing group. This is my concern for where critical theory in particular, not necessarily just critical race theory, but critical theory in particular seems to be taking our culture towards tribalism that always ends. It always ends in bloodshed. It always ends in violence. It always ends in catastrophe. There's not a historical example of where it's worked. Marx had great ideas. He had great aspirations. When you read the doctrine of Marxism and Engels and Marx, when you read it, it looks great. And it really appeals to the intellectual. The problem is it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It is built upon premises of theft, of murder. Even in the Communist Manifesto, which I have read, Marx says that the only way to achieve the utopia is for the violent overthrow of one class for another. Switch that out into today's language with critical race. It looks as though if that were to manifest in the same terms, it would mean that one race would rise up in an attempt to violently overthrow the other. From a sociological perspective, I have two concerns. These concerns, I think, are validated, and I believe that they are. I believe that they're proven in history. As Christians, when we become born again, you know, the Apostle Paul says that old things are passed away and all things are become new. That we are to take on the identity of Christ. In Galatians, he says that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are in Christ. And as Christians, we have to somehow find a way to kill the flesh, to crucify the flesh, until we are living examples of that within the larger society. So the two issues that I see coming are in line with they're in line with this idea of identity. If there were, let's say that the oppressed groups, as viewed by critical race theorists, the oppressed groups managed to somehow subvert the justice system. Let's just say hypothetically that the Constitution of the United States is deemed as inherently racist and it's done away with. A new system that emerges, whether it be through violent overthrow or manipulation, it must draw upon violence or manipulation to maintain power. Therefore, you're recreating another system that seeks to establish authority and power that must only function by oppressing others. There's no other way to look at it. That's one negative outcropping from this thing. The other is, my Bible says that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. If we are continuing to tell people that regardless of what they do, regardless of how they act, that they are inherently racist, that they're white supremacists, that because of what happened 200 years ago or 50 years ago or 10 years ago, that there's no opportunity for change, that there's no opportunity for regeneration, and there's no grace acceptable to reestablish that person's identity, eventually people will start to believe that. And we have an old standby that says those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so either one group rises up and begins to oppress the other, or the other group begins to believe that they are oppressors, begins to believe that they are racists, and they begin to act on it. However that manifests, and there may be 100 variables or other ways that can manifest in between, but I see that as the two extremes that we have to be aware of. And I've said this before, that when Antifa and Black Lives Matter and the rioting began last year over the death of George Floyd, I said this repeatedly. I see the anger, I see the discontent with the different groups. Some of it is obviously justified. Listen, race is a real thing. Or racism is a real thing, rather. Hatred is a real thing. And we have to, as Christians, we have to oppose it. We have to call those things out. It is evil. It is not God's plan. But as I began to say last year, when these groups begin to rise up, it's not these groups that concern me. It is the response of the radical right and of these other groups that violently oppose this ideology that concern me. Because when that group begins to rise up in opposition, we have complete and total civil unrest in our country. Culture transforms slowly. There are arguably about 7 different elements that establish culture in any given economy, any given society. And when you really begin to study critical race and you really begin to study neo-Marxism and how it has manifested itself in our education system and the government and our marketplace, it has not happened instantly. It's happened very, very slowly. And it has happened, excuse me, with the concerted effort of dedicated practitioners of this ideology. I feel as though what God is calling the church to in America today is a foundational principles of love. The foundational principles of loving the person right in front of us. Some friends of mine, they call it their supreme ethic of stopping for the one. That means that their ministry, their ethic is summed up in this: whoever is in front of me, I lay down my life for that person, and I'm willing to love them, to support them, to strengthen them, to pray for them, to minister to them. And I think as Christians, I'm prefacing this next statement with this. As Christians, the question is, how do we respond to this? How do we react to what's taking place in our culture today? The number one thing that we could do that would further the problem is to react like the rest of the world. The number one thing that we could do would be to respond carnally. It would be to respond as normal human beings would respond. I really believe that even though our society looks as though it may be unraveling, it presents to us as evangelical Christians an opportunity to demonstrate Christ and to begin preaching the gospel from the position of the cross. As we begin to take on the nature of Jesus, as we begin to love the people in front of us, I really and truly believe that we'll see a revival in our country. I really and truly believe that we'll see an awakening in our nation. If you look at the history of America, God has shaped America through revival, through awakenings. Just a few decades ago, we had the radical 60s and 70s. And if you look at the college campuses during that era, America was on the verge of total anarchy. America was on the verge of social overthrow. But God did something beautiful. He raised up a revival and an awakening in the hippies of San Francisco, and the Jesus movement swept across our nation's campuses. The Jesus movement began to touch lives and transform people. And where there was anarchy and uprising and rioting and protesting, what came out of that was the love of God being proclaimed. And you saw Maranatha music and Calvary Chapel and all of these great moves of God were birthed out of that movement. I really and truly believe that regardless of where America is today, regardless of what we're staring at in terms of violence or societal uprising or rioting or whatever it may be, the answer is not more protesting. It's not more government. The answer to our problem is a revival. It is an awakening to those people that have denied Christ, to those people that have rejected him, an awakening to the realities of who he is. God can change our nation in one day. He can change our nation in one movement. In one sermon, God can touch the heart of the right person, and we can see our nation begin to turn and come back to its roots of being founded upon Judeo-Christian principles. We cannot allow ourselves to identify with this group or that group, and this is the problem with critical race in evangelical churches. It has actually begun to creep into, some of the pulpits and some of the teaching systems of our churches. There is nothing of critical race theory that is coherent or conducive to Christianity. Nothing. Simply because it equates fallen identities as a reality of every human being. And as Christians, if we relate to the fallen identity, we live in it. Therefore, we make the problem worse. But we have to get back to the fundamental principles of revival. And I wanted to wrap this up. I've been talking for too long, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to wrap it up with this. Reform does not always bring revival. Our nation needs reform. We need to understand some things that have gone wrong. We do need to reestablish some of our systems without question. But reform does not bring revival. However, revival always brings reform. When we begin to transform the hearts of our own congregants, of our own pulpits, of our own lives, when we begin to examine ourselves and ask the question, how can I get on the cross and be more like Jesus? Then the things around us, the systems around us, the people around us will begin to get transformed as well. And I believe that a revival in the heart of the church is the key to an awakening in the heart of America.
Well, we have just heard an outstanding presentation by Bryan Bivens. It was scholarly. It is real life. It's something that's going on among all of us. And so, we've all heard about things going on at school board meetings, and we're like, what is my response, and how should I think about this? And, what do I tell people at my church or Sunday school? And this is an excellent presentation. I urge you to share it with a friend. Bryan's a tremendous resource and mind. If you want to learn more about the Institute for Christian Defense, about us, please go to defendingthefaith.law. And we would appreciate it if you would sign up for our newsletter. There's also opportunities to support us. We don't have a lot of people, but we have some people that support us on a monthly basis, and that's how we love it. If everybody just gives a little bit, then we can help everybody, because you never know when it's going to be your turn that needs legal help. And so most of the cases that we do pro bono. We took 3 new cases this week, and it's because of your support that is made possible. So God bless you, and we will see you in the next episode of Defending the Faith.